we will crack into it. I'll do some intros first. My name's Dr. Rosie Bosworth. I am a future foods expert, but I typically specialise in alternative protein systems. So I'll come to this with a bit of throw the cynic in the room when we're talking about regenerative agriculture and animal grazing when I'm more specialised in alternative proteins. To my immediate left, I have Guy Webb, and he is the Managing Director of SoilCQuest. Guy has more than a decade's experience designing functional and practical microbial packages with dryland broadacre systems for semi-arid environments. He's the Managing Director of SoilCQuest, an independent non-profit that was established to fast-track the research, development and deployment of a new gigaton capacity soil carbon sequestration biotechnology. The end goal is to reduce the excess atmospheric carbon that threatens global food security and to improve the world's agricultural soils, making them more fertile and resilient. We have Margaret Mackenzie, the Vice President of TerViva. TerViva produces a very interesting agricultural crop called Pongamia, which is a non-GMO orchard tree crop that can be grown with little or no irrigation and produces oil seeds that are produced into oil for biofuel, plant protein for animal feed or biogas, and biomass for baseload electricity generation. And Pongamia is transforming distressed agricultural lands into productive sources of protein and renewable biotech while sequestering carbon. And then we have, I have a broken left dominant hand, so I'm trying my best to get everything done properly. Harry Young, the Executive Director of Tiverton Rothwell Ag Fund. Harry has been directly involved in agricultural production for 30 years, principally in grazing farmland in southwest Victoria, which covers lamb, wool and beef production and forestry operations. Harry's working knowledge of soil science, plant biology and animal requirements has enabled him to successfully establish a soil amelioration program, enhancing sustainability and productivity across a range of farmland, with a key aspect on composting for his production. So I'm going to just start with opening up the floor to our speakers to hear a little bit more about how their operations are fitting into the whole regenerative agricultural discussion. But first, I just sort of like to talk about the fact that, or the elephant in the room, is that meat consumption is rising globally. UN Report has recently estimated that it will grow, meat production will grow by 76% by 2050, and at the same time, global emissions will need to approach a net zero for the world to limit the worst impacts of climate change. And as we know, livestock, dairy and animal agriculture are key contributors to climate change. So I would love to talk to you all about how your operations are playing a role in this and how regenerative agriculture can it help solve our climate solutions, or does it play just a small role bottom of the cliff solution going forward? It'd be great to have these discussions. So, Guy, if you'd like to start off, it'd be great to hear about SoilCQuest and what you guys are doing. You've got some pretty big ambitions that I'd like you to talk about with the audience.
Yeah, definitely, Rosie. Thanks for that. We do have some very big ambitions at SoilCQuest. I hope we haven't got our ambitions mixed up with our abilities. But fundamentally, we're looking at soil carbon as the metric for sustainable agriculture, be it regenerative agriculture or everyday monoculture type agriculture. The one metric that underpins that fertility of that system is carbon, and basically since industrialised agriculture, we've been paid as an industry to extract carbon from the system. So we take the trees off, and then we use practices that degrade carbon in the soil. In fact, the world's soils agricultural soils have lost somewhere around 60% of their carbon content. So we've monetised the extraction of carbon out of the agricultural system. So we're really keen on looking at ways that you can monetise farmers to put carbon back in the system, for a regenerative agricultural system, but also from a climate change mitigation tool. We've got the largest terrestrial carbon sink on the planet, which is the agricultural soils. Around about 1.8 billion hectares are put down to annual crops each year, so an area about the size of South America is cropped, and an area about the size of Africa is grazed. So it's a massive footprint, which makes agriculturalists the largest climate army on the planet, because they control the largest climate sink that's on the planet, and it all revolves around this thing we call soil carbon. So that's kind of big picture stuff for our organisation. Small picture stuff and very small picture stuff getting underneath the microscope. We're looking at specific soil biology that are responsible for sequestering carbon, and whether we can make an inoculum out of that, out of specific fungi that are very good at taking carbohydrate flow of the plant and stabilising it into the soil. So that's the aim for us, is to make it easy and economic for farmers to coat their seeds as they're sowing the crop with the organism that's good at this job, and just through normal practice of sowing their crops become carbon sequestration agriculturalists, and the potential of whether we could monetise that for farmers as well. So that's kind of a quick overview, Rosie.
Yeah, okay, great. Thank you for that. We'll get into the nitty-gritty of this technology as we go through as well, because it'll be really interesting to hear about how that fits into monocultures. Margaret, let's hear a little bit more about TerViva.
Sure. So TerViva grows a tree called Pongamia. It's native to Australia. It's actually native to the eastern coast of Queensland and the northern coast of Australia, and it's a leguminous tree that produces seeds like this, and when you take the husk off them, they look like this. So historically, this tree, it's been known to people for generations, for centuries really. People have been crushing it in India, and Aboriginal people here in Australia have been crushing it for lamp oil. It's a very oily seed. And when they've not used it for lamp oil, they've used it in Ayurvedic medicine because it does in fact have antiseptic properties. But it's historically been considered inedible. What TerViva has done is we've figured out how to make the seed meal, after you crush out the oil, we figured out how to make that edible. And that's a big deal, it turns out, because the nutritional content of this seed is comparable to the nutritional content of yellow pea. Very high protein, fantastic amino acid profile. If it's edible, it's good food for people, and it's good food for humans in terms of protein, or for animals in terms of protein content. What's really interesting about that, so all that's good, right? But what about sustainability? What's really interesting about that is that I apologize, I'm American, so I talk acres rather than hectares, so you'll forgive me in advance, please. But what's really interesting about that is on a per acre basis, Pongamia yields more oil and protein than either soy or yellow pea. And what's really interesting about that is that unlike those crops, which are annual and require tilling and require a tremendous amount of water and require a tremendous amount of fertilizer and nutrients, so nutrients run off into whatever watershed you've got, Pongamia is a tree. It's permanent. It's a permanent crop. So you put it in the ground, you dig a hole, you maybe rip some weeds away, but that's it. You put it in the ground and it stays there for 15, 20, 25 years. You harvest it every year the way you harvest a nut crop. And the tree itself requires a fraction of the water and the pesticides and the nutrients that soy or yellow pea or other protein crops require. So we've taken what's been a historically known tree to humans, made it edible, and along the way have figured out that this is actually a hugely sustainable crop, because once it's there, it never moves, and it really doesn't need much help to produce some of the best plant protein we've seen in the market.
Harry.
Thank you very much, and I'll just give you a bit of a background of our history and our most recent expansion into our Tiverton Rothwell Agriculture Fund. I've spent 30 years in running agricultural operations, mainly in livestock, as discussed in southwest Victoria. About 12 years ago, I got suspicious that we'd flatlined in our productivity and was noticing some negative livestock attributes. So I started inquiring about liquid fertilisers and other forms of providing nitrogen, phosphorus and potassium in particular, and trace elements to a lesser degree. That led me down a 5-year path of a principle which was liquid fertilisers to provide the plant with the micronutrients and macronutrients to basically push through soil impediments in the soil. That was largely successful, so we had grasses, perennial grasses, both deep-rooted and ryegrasses, pushing down 30 and 40 centimetres, which would only ever be able to get to about 10 centimetres. Then that progressed to a compost operation, and we did a 4-year study of compost, and we found an incredible response in the soil biota, which is measured by DNA, and we didn't identify, I beg your pardon. We kind of used a shotgun approach that we just keep putting this out, the results keep getting better, and we got to the stage where it became too complex to reverse engineer what was really working. So I'm really interested in Guy's fungi that he's developed, because he's blazing a trail there, and I'm sure he'll discover exactly what we've found. We just can't name it or do anything with it. So out of that, we decided we needed to benchmark all our operations and make sure we weren't kidding ourselves on the objective measurement. And so we've been benchmarking each enterprise for 18 years. And so we've been able to track really directly the output per hectare versus the alternate inputs that we've been using. And the last 2 years we're involved in a benchmarking group with 14 other farms in our region, all open book, and suffice to say that the performance of the farm is right in the top 5%, both on a profitability point of view and a production per hectare. So I figure that we've been able to regenerate our soil and also not lose any productivity, because regenerative ag and sustainable ag have to be profitable, otherwise they fall over at the first hurdle. So we've taken all of that IP, we'll call it, and we've launched an agricultural fund 2 years ago. We've raised money from high net worths in Australia, quite a considerable amount of money, and purchased 5 farming operations from Queensland through to the Murray River. We've got a table grape business, stone fruit business, 2 broadacre cropping businesses, and we're embarking on a large olive planting, which we're pretty excited about. We're doing in conjunction with Boundary Bend. And on each of those operations, we're taking a really clinical look at the soil attributes, the corridors for Indigenous plantings. We also have 3, we're just about to finish our 3rd feral-proof fence around country that we're releasing threatened species back into. So that's been a hobby of mine and my partners for probably 12 years. And so we've got 4,000 acres actually fenced off, which we're about to embark on releasing, or we're translocating eastern barred bandicoot, spotted quoll, tiger quoll from one farm to another so we can breed them up on the larger farm. We've also got quite a large grass offset program going, where we sell the right to the native grasses, which are very, very threatened to end users. So we're monetising those ecological outcomes, or pursuits, sorry. So when we wrap all that together and overlay a commercial cropping operation which utilises all Guy's thinking, zero-till, sensible rotations, and add to that the threatened species work, carbon sequestration. Last year we signed the first approved methodology with the federal government with their ERF. And we sold them quite a substantial sum of carbon, which we've now got to baseline the farm and then remeasure in 5 and 10 years' time and sequester carbon and evidence the fact that we're sequestering those CO2 equivalents. So there's quite a bit going on, and I think we'll hand it over for questions.
Got a lot going on there. It's interesting. We have the whole sort of grassroots regenerative agriculture going on with Harry, and then we have more high-tech regenerative agriculture or carbon drawdown measures through TerViva and SoilCQuest. So it's interesting because we don't just have pastoral systems around the world, as you know. We in Australia, New Zealand, where I'm from, a lot of free-range farming and pastoral farming, but that's not the only form of farming around the world that needs to be addressed through regenerative agriculture. So, Guy, what I'm really interested in around your technology, if you could speak more about it, is around the fact that this is almost like an entry point for monoculture crop production and/or sort of broad acreage farming that isn't just a biodiverse landscape, and it enables, as you mentioned, sort of just the wheat growers or whatnot, some form of solution to the problem. Can you explain more about that?
Yeah, I think, Rosie, it's like an entry point to regenerative agriculture. As I mentioned earlier, we've lost a lot of carbon out of our soil. So a lot of the soils I'm dealing with in central New South Wales with my growers are, around that 1% organic carbon soil. They probably have been native soils of 2.5%, 3%. So there's been a lot of carbon lost in those soils. And when you're farming those sorts of soils, you store less water, you store less nutrients. The structure of the soil's not as good. It gets tougher and tougher the more you lose carbon out of your soil. It's a real metric of how healthy your soil is. So we figure the theory is that if we can make it easy for farmers to step into carbon sequestration, so giving some social benefits there to climate change mitigation and so on, but in their business actually building up carbon to a level where they can step off and try other things. So it's like an easy entry point. We're going to build our carbon, start seeing things that the carbon is benefiting their production systems, and then hopefully facilitate into, can we do multi-species cover cropping? Can we crimp roll out cover crops instead of sprayed out fallows? Let's reduce our amount of tillages that we're doing and get a real focus on that carbon component in the soil. And it really is trying to get that culture that create soil carbon as the metric for the business, and once you get that in the mind for the grower and in the culture of agriculture, then you start getting somewhere to adopting all and sundry of these regenerative practices.
Have you seen them say, for example, your average wheat farmer, for example, doesn't know anything else? That's all they've done. And have you seen an application of this technology having them diversify into other forms of crop production or moving
definitely.
away from monocultures?
I think it's an opening point for the conversation. For my growers, we're in sort of semi-marginal sort of country, I guess, and for them to step out and start doing some of these regenerative practices, it takes a big leap of faith, and it takes a bigger checkbook to take that risk as well. And I think if you make it easy for them to take that risk and then see the benefits come back in, then they're prepared to take more risks, and you're opening up that conversation. But on the flip side of that, there's a lot of hectares out there that are farmed because they're high rainfall areas with good soils, and they lend themselves to a monoculture system economically. Like Harry was saying, actually employing good rotations is a kind of like a polyculture, but a staggered polyculture system. So if you're growing back-to-back cereals year in, year out, then that's probably a system doomed to failure. But if you employ good rotations in that system, you can actually have quite a sustainable system. And that's probably 90-odd% of world agriculture goes on like that. And the context that we see it is that we're actually on the stopwatch at the moment against climate change. We're hearing it at this conference. John Kerry there this morning really nailed it with the urgency around it. And if we look at the science, the IPCC report tells us that we've got 12 years to turn things around. We can actually start measuring that in days. It's not long to actually do something fairly significant and fairly serious at scale. And we look at it through those lenses. We say, this is what we've got to work with, agriculture as it is. How can we make it more sustainable, and how can we pull down a whole heap of carbon as fast as we can using agriculture as the deployment mechanism? Because in reality, if we don't solve the climate issue in time, we don't solve any of these other issues. No. So we've got to tick that box first. We've got to get the scale and the capacity and engage agriculture on that level as it is and take them forward. Sure, all these regenerative practices, I'm promoting them on a daily basis to my growers, but the uptake is slow, and there's impediments there from an economic point of view and from a risk aversion point of view. And then you throw in a couple of droughts and a flood or two, and it makes it hard for farmers to even think about adopting a new technology. So under those circumstances, we need to hit the go button on something that's very rapid deployment and very large scale that can pull down a lot of carbon in a short period of time, and that's sort of the lens that we see the world through. Yeah,
interesting. Margaret, the TerViva's technology is also somewhat carbon sequestration in terms of the nitrogen fixing with the legume. But can you explain, as I understand, that it's more of a subtropical plant? We can't, for example, with Guy, that's for monocultures, and that's really very vital for carbon drawdown in our monocultural system. But yours is a slightly more specific plant, but it has been able to replace somewhat stranded assets in terms of citrus groves and whatnot. Explain that.
Right. So I'll start with citrus. So you're right. Pongamia is a tropical and subtropical tree. It wouldn't be happy here in Victoria, for example. It's too chilly. Likes it up in Queensland and NT. So, and we're growing it in the U.S. and Florida and Hawaii. I'll describe what we're doing in Florida as a good example of how Pongamia can fit into sort of the existing farming infrastructure and ecology. So I don't know if you're familiar with this, but in Florida orange juice has been just a huge juggernaut of a business for a long, long time. It is completely failing, and it's failing now. They have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of acres of orange trees planted, and all of them are getting something called citrus greening disease, which is killing off orchards entirely. It was sad, but also a lucky break for TerViva, because these citrus trees were in a place where Pongamia grows, and we were able to put this in as a drop-in crop for Florida farmers to generate income off of land that they were otherwise going to have to write off. The carbon sequestration in this case was a benefit, but it wasn't necessary to make it a huge win for them. And it looks like Pongamia is now going to become a major crop in the part of Florida that planted acres and acres of orange trees. So when we look at Australian agriculture as an example, and look at areas where people are just doing, whether it's many crops or a few crops, Pongamia is really useful in a couple of ways, just really briefly. I don't want to spend a ton of time on this, but for example, I've talked with croppers up in central Queensland who are, they're planting regular row crops, right? Broadacre crops, but they have parts of their paddock that they can't plant for whatever reason. And these are places where Pongamia would grow very well and create additional income for those farmers. I think your point was really well taken, that it doesn't help to tell the farmer, hey, this is really great because it sequesters carbon. It does. I mean, we're sequestering carbon at 50 to 75 ton an acre, and that's great. But that's not, the farmer's like, yeah, okay. I mean, and maybe I get the carbon offset. But the fact that we're also increasing his farm income at the same time, that's what sells the project. Right, and that's how we fit in the subtropical areas of the world where the tree grows.
Have you seen much adoption as the adoption just growing and growing, the interest with the farming community, and could we drop that into, where would you see it, say, play out in Australia, for example, where citrus hasn't had the dieback that Florida has?
Yeah, I think in Australia the opportunity isn't probably, it may be citrus, but we're not focusing on that. One of the areas where we're focusing is the fact that some of the land that's being grazed right now is really, really tired land. It needs regeneration, and what's interesting about Pongamia, because it's a leguminous tree, is it not only sequesters carbon, it drops nitrogen back into the soil, which improves the soil and actually improves the grass, improves the forage for the cattle as they're eating, it makes it more nutritious. So we're seeing opportunities in and around grazing land as well as along the edges of cropping land.
Okay, interesting. Harry, with all the organic, the composting, can you explain to the audience, in my mind, I was really interested as livestock farming, how composting is being used to help improve the farming operations? And you did mention a little bit about how you're able to sequester carbon. Have you been able to measure it? Have there been sort of finite measurements of how composting and your other regenerative measures help with carbon, since it's such a hot topic with climate change and livestock?
Sure. John Carey was pretty direct this morning, so I'll take a leaf out of his book. If every farmer in the high rainfall region of Australia achieved what we've achieved over the last 10 years, we'd wipe out the whole of Australia's carbon footprint. Full stop. So that comes from composting and understanding what you're doing with residual grazing, so you don't take the covers down too low over summer. Same in cropping, you must keep stubble. And so my interest, as I said, led to making compost, which we make out of waste streams, so pig, cattle, chicken, sheep, duck manures, and green waste out of the city that's been cleaned. There's some fantastic cleaning technology that comes out of Europe. Every single council in Australia should have it, and they should be turning their green waste into something that's valuable, because it's a supremely valuable product to go into composting. It's the form of carbon. So all of your compost starts at 28:1 or 30:1 C to N ratio. So that's kind of how much C you've got to have in the system to get the machine going. Process takes about 12 weeks. You use a simple mathematic equation to get the ratios of each of your inputs right on a dry matter basis. I bought a turner from America, from Edwin Blosser, who's a Mennonite, wonderful soil scientist in Illinois. And so then we started, and the recipe is relatively simple, and you start and incorporate water. It's about a 10 to 12 week process. The temperature goes up from ambient temperature, and within the first day it will go to about 58 degrees, where it sits, if you've got everything right, sits at 58 degrees for those 80 days. And on the 85th day, you'll go up and the temperature's back at ambient and the job is done and it's ready to spread. So we've used, so going back to talking NPK, we're putting out about 25 units of N, about 18 to 22 units of P, and about 35 units of K in our grazing operations, and that's about a tonne to the hectare. So what we've measured in our grazing operations is soil organic matter levels of going from about 3%, bearing in mind most of Australia's cropland is less than 1%. So already a grazing operation is going to be well in front of a cropping operation. But we've taken that 3% to about 7.5% across two quite substantial farming operations. And I think we've bought about 20 days of growing season already. So we're normally about 220 days of growing season out of 365. I think we're getting close to 240 days. And for every 1% of soil organic matter you go up, you'll conserve an extra 150,000 litres of moisture in the top 10 centimetres. So if you just think about that, that's akin to buying rainfall. And if you ask any cropper in marginal areas about finishing rain, and the capacity to store extra moisture in your top 10 centimetres, it becomes a very big economic discussion. So that's happened. So I'm an advocate of it, first thing.
So you mentioned that if all grazing operations followed such measures, you'd be carbon neutral. Australia would be carbon neutral in the agricultural sector.
No, the whole of the country.
The whole of the country. So that, in my mind, because I'm not a regenerative agriculture specialist, suggests that not only does it's that the agriculture actually can be a carbon sink rather than a carbon emitter, and that sends for many like right moments to some.
That's why we need Guy and measurement technology and the backing of government to fast track economic measurement systems so that we can get out and have cause and effect. I mean, we've used the shotgun approach, right? We've gone overboard to prove a point. We need to refine that enormously.
Yes, and so we talked earlier about that. That sounds in theory that agriculture could become a carbon sink, but however, what about, does that really translate when we think about the percentage of the world's population that are not grazing operations? They are conventional feedlot farms or those factory farming, really high production, high density, feedlots. That's never going to happen. You're never going to see a feedlot in America be a carbon sink, and many would think. Unless we can put some of these practices in place into these. So do you really think that agriculture can be a carbon sink if we're to think about the whole system in general, beyond grazing?
Well, we did a pretty good job of destroying our soil carbon, so the answer to your question is it's an in globo effort, and everyone, it's not going to happen tomorrow. It mightn't happen in 30 years, but as long as the highway starts heading in the right direction and we can measure it more efficiently, the adoption rate will be far higher. And if you're a rational businessman, and if I can come to someone in 10 years' time and say, I'll manage everything under the soil, you'll be no worse off above the soil, and by the way, you don't have to pay for fertiliser, I think it's a pretty compelling argument. That's the holy grail.
What are your thoughts?
I'd just like to say, Harry, you want to be a little bit careful saying those sorts of things because you're going to make agriculture sound attractive and fun. And that is what you're seeing. I mean, I think you're right on the right track. It's impressive what you've done, Harry. Like, you should be really commended for those efforts. But what you're talking about is one way that you've been able to sequester carbon. And in answer to your question, Rosie, there's probably a number of ways that we can do it if we stick to the principle of how that carbon sequestration event happens. But the most important point, moreover, is that there's the monetary value put on the carbon, whether it be as a straight cold hard carbon trade, or whether it's the economic value of it, as you're illustrating, Harry. If you can illustrate it to farmers in terms of this 150,000 litres of water, so that's about 15 mils of rain, every rain event that you're storing in your soil. To add to that, every 1% holds about 20 kilos of nitrogen, and your infiltration rates double. Now, they're economic parameters that you can add to the equation on an Excel spreadsheet in a farmer's logistics, saying these are the sort of economics we need to assess. And we're seeing it like where we're farming at the moment. We're in the grips of second-year drought in a row. Soil moisture is just everything. And anywhere what we're seeing with our cropping systems this year, anywhere where anyone's done anything towards improving organic carbon and cover on their crop, on their soil, we're seeing really dramatic results because it's an extreme season. And they're very real economics that come out of that. So I think it's just shining the spotlight on what soil carbon can do to an agricultural business and make it around an economic decision, and then you get adoption.
Margaret, what are your thoughts on the fact of this sort of mass scale application of these regenerative techniques?
A couple of things, I guess. I think creating economic benefit for the system broadly, in addition to carbon benefit, is critical to it, right? I mean, you can't divorce them, because people want to do things for the right reason, but they do things for economic reasons. And that's what funds new technology, that's what funds acquisition of land, is people say, hey, I'm going to make money doing this, right? I mean, and so if we can find ways to sequester carbon and improve our soils and make money doing it, that's the silver bullet right there. So is there a mass scale? Was there one way to do it? I don't think so. I mean, I'd like to think there is, but there's not just one way to do it. We gotta create momentum by chipping away at many different use cases, many different parts of the system, and eventually some things are gonna, and they gotta go ahead fast, but they need to, some things will go ahead naturally because the economics work, because they're easier to do, because the inputs are, the ability is there to do it. But I don't think there's one big bet. I mean, we were talking, for example, and everybody talks about the beef industry. You and I were talking about this earlier today. Well, let's just not eat meat, right? Because beef puts lots of methane in the environment. Well, guess what? I mean, I'm sorry, but that's a loser argument. People aren't going to stop eating meat, right? And lots of people are making money off the industry. So instead, certainly make plant protein available, but also let's chip away at the carbon impact of the beef industry until we can prove that this is actually a more economic way to grow cattle, to grow meat. We got to do all those things at the same time.
Yeah. It seems we do have two schools of thought sort of happening around the whole carbon, or the whole beef, livestock and carbon. You've got the school of thought, the IPCC and the Eat Lancet report saying we need to just cut back dramatically on livestock production, on meat consumption, for climate change, number one, for our health and all sorts. And then we have renowned authors that are really pro regenerative livestock, like Dan Barber, suggesting actually, I'm not sure if many of you know, well, most of us have probably heard about the Impossible Burger. And Dan Barber's a great author and chef renowned for promoting regenerative techniques. And he recently posted on his blog and on Instagram this week, let's call it, instead of the impossible steak, but let's call it the possible steak. Flank steak from a 9-year-old 100% grass-fed Blue Hill Farm dairy cow. It's not only possible, it's necessary, not because it's so indescribably delicious or because of the economic benefit to a grass-fed, grass-based dairy farmer is significant. It's necessary because the world depends on it. Healthy landscapes need healthy pastures need grazing animals. Grazing animals maintain and improve healthy soil. Healthy soil is microbially active soil. Microbial activity captures methane, amongst other things, and it goes on. So then we have these other influential speakers saying, actually, that's bullshit. We need animals in the system. So it's really interesting to see the sort of dichotomy of what's going on right now. In my mind, I'm so entrenched in the alternative protein system, I'm inclined to think, or even the most regenerative agricultural systems, because I'm not in your industry, are never going to be enough, and we cannot scale regenerative agriculture or pastoral systems like that for every single cow on the planet. It's just not capable, to feed, in my mind, to feed the growing masses in such a way. We'd probably need 2 more planets of space. Not so much in terms of our capability, but the areas. So it's really interesting just to hear your thoughts around these 2 schools of thought. One's agriculture's dead, the other's no, agriculture's absolutely pivotal. And so we'll have a bit of talk, and then we will open up for questions after that. Yeah.
I think the devil's in the detail with regard to that. It's all about the system that you take on board and how that system is managed. Bringing tree crops into a system, rotational grazing, being careful of how you're managing that biomass. And then that comes down to a carbon accounting of okay, the cows have farted X amount of methane, we can calculate that, but we've sequestered X amount into the soil, where's the budget end up? And just being responsible with that. A bit busy, that one, mate.
It's very, very fizzy, this one.
So it is really, it's not a cookie cutter approach, I think, and different systems, different environments, different soils, different economic contexts will drive the system. But if the metric is carbon, then you can actually measure that. You can measure it in the soil, you can measure it in the landscape, you can measure it in trees. And bringing, I'm really interested to see whether your trees grow at Forbes, actually, because I might have some land for you. But, if all of a sudden you've got a metric you can actually measure something by, then you can manage for it. You can't manage unless you can measure, is the old saying. And whatever the system that you're employing, if your metric is carbon, the amount of carbon I'm sequestering versus the amount of carbon that I'm putting back into the system, and you can monetise that system, and then you've got inspiration for farmers to actually focus on carbon in the system. So that'd be my thoughts, is that the devil's in the detail of how that system, and having the practitioners maintain their profitability on the land. So people like Harry, incredible amount of hard-won information in that head, I suspect, and probably a few mistakes along the way potentially. That sort of brains trust in the landscape, and being able to, farmers learn peer to peer. They love to go to field days, and they love to read, and we're in an information age obviously, so we can get on the Googleator and Google up stuff and learn a lot of stuff, but they still learn peer to peer. So I imagine you've got in your peer group, Harry, that people will lean over the fence and say, how'd you do that? And or in your social group, and people will listen to that because there's a guy that's done it hard, the hard way, learnt it yourself, gathered the information, gone all the effort, and got a result. So I'm going to follow that person because they've actually done it, and that's why farmers learn peer-to-peer, because it's an honest way of transferring information. And so that encouraging that peer-to-peer learning and bringing that conversation up as using carbon as the metric is what I see as the way forward, I think.
Yeah. So we can talk a bit more about if there's such urgency in this, what needs to happen next to facilitate farmers to transition to these new technologies or these new or old ways of farming. Does government need to intervene? How are we going to facilitate this, particularly if cash is a barrier to entry into these new ways of farming or these more carbon beneficial ways of farming?
So I'll jump into that just really quickly. I'm a big believer in free markets. It's probably coming out. I'm talking about it's the economics, right? I think government does have a role in this, but I think government's role doesn't have to be to lead it. Government's role has to be to help it. So I think that farmers and landowners and people that are interested in all these businesses need to say, okay, here's how my business can work, right? Here's how my land can be productive. Here's how my product, my Pongamia trees can flourish in Australia. It'll work great if I do it this way. It'll work even better if I get help with the following things. And where government's role, I think the great role for government in the following things is for government to help people take the long bet that's involved in agriculture, right? You got to wait a while for agriculture to pay off quite often. Certainly in tree crops, certainly in my business.
No, you don't plant a seed.
And so
and expect it to.
if government can help people make the investments that allow the long bet to become economically possible, that's the role of government. But government shouldn't have to lead. If government has to lead, it doesn't make sense in the first place. That's my personal opinion.
Okay. Yeah. Well, we have a bit of time for questions. I believe there was an app
Yes, so I'll stand in and pretend I'm an app, and I'll facilitate some of the questions that have come through. So the first one is really around we talked a little bit about the need to be able to measure the impact in this space. So I'd love to hear from all of you, maybe starting with Harry, about how do you see technology playing a role in unlocking the potential of regenerative agriculture and helping, I guess, measure and communicate what you're achieving on some of your farms?
Technology has a massive role, and we are, I think, about 10% away along the curve of where it needs to be. Necessity is the mother of invention, and there's so many innovative businesses out there in this space. What we need is for the auditors, just pick soil carbon for instance, we need a meeting of the minds between government, end users of carbon, so carbon emitters, should and if there becomes a price on carbon. So the auditors need to be happy to give the people that may purchase this as an offset the confidence that it's real, and that was abused to Billio in Canada with the minimum till movement, and did the whole industry about 10 years of damage. So there was insincere measurement systems that led to a lack of confidence, which shut down the industry naturally, no government intervention. You've got places like Alberta, which have got interesting carbon trading frameworks, which our government needs to study what's around the world and look what's worked over time. And then, so leading back to the measurement tools, we need measurement tools that can give an indication real time. So that, again, the cause and effect, what works, what's boosted things on a half year basis. You're never going to measure it down to the month, but sort of every 5 years is too slow to say, I did this and then 5 years later I've had this better result. That's far too slow. There's more to just the carbon story than just measuring soil carbon, because if you think about if a bushfire comes through or if a flood comes through, you've got to be able to have kind of a mathematical calculation, and Guy probably can talk to this much better than me, that picks up all these other nuances and adds it to the total story. So how we get the funding to get that happening pronto, and there isn't a developed country in the world that's not trying to look at this objectively and push it forward.
Yeah, great. I'll link that into another question and maybe throw it over to Guy. So there's another question around why isn't everybody doing this? And I know for Harry, he's selling his carbon credits back to emitters, and so is forced to measure it in a credible way so that you can then on-sell it. Why are more people not thinking about this and measuring the amount of carbon that they're locking up in their farms?
Yep, it's a good question. I think everything has a starting point somewhere along the line, and it hasn't had a lot of strong focus traditionally in the past, but it definitely is getting a lot of focus more recently in amongst regenerative growers right through to conventional growers. So it has come up on the radar. I think there's a lack of understanding. It's a bit of an opaque kind of system. There's a bit of a lack of understanding and transparency about how the system actually works, and the current system we've got is quite a complex system, and farmers are already running complex businesses, so another complex thing that's not quite sure about, and it's fairly new. We're a risk-averse bunch of people because we're already dealing with changing in climate and a lot of risk already in the system, so taking more risk on's never all that attractive. So I think that's the challenge ahead, is to simplify it and make it easy for farmers to step into that monetising of carbon. And that's what the name of the game is. And that's probably where the resources should be put towards from government, not to lead but to facilitate. to say, okay, what are these leaders that we've got in our own country that are doing things a bit differently, are actually getting results? How do we structure that up so we can make that an information package for other growers so they can have the aha moment themselves and go, okay, I could probably do that now that you've put it in that way. I can understand it, I can evaluate it as a risk, and then, I can either adopt it or not. So I think we're on that early part of the curve in that process, and now is the time to put the pedal to the metal and actually invest in this space, because it is, we've had meetings with the other side of the fence with emitters that are looking to offset their carbon emissions even on the where they get to do it themselves, and that market is getting very, very large around the world, and they're looking for carbon credits somewhere to buy, and soil carbon credits are really the premium top-end, top-shelf kind of carbon credit, because it means food security, and there's lots of story you can tell around managing landscapes more sustainably, and there's a good PR story in buying soil carbon credits. So, we have the capacity to develop really premium-grade carbon credits. We just need to put a bit of energy into that. Like any new emerging industry, you need to put the investment in, put the energy in, get the innovators and the excited people pushing forward and focused, and you get an outcome coming out of that every time.
Is it also more along the lines of that, for example, not many people, I hadn't heard of it before, maybe a communications exercise as well, really getting out there in the marketing and promotion of such new technologies and how necessary that is. I mean, if it's here, none of us know about it, then it's, as good as dead. So about really having the resource put into promoting it to the masses of the agricultural community.
I think
Most definitely, yeah.
Sorry. I'll put some relativity around this. So we sold 300,000 tonnes of CO2 equivalents units, ACCUs, last year. And there's 2 customers that have approached us through a colleague in Canada, and that's to grow or create 300,000 tonnes over 10 years. So 30,000 tonnes a year, straight line, which doesn't quite work like that, but 2 customers, 5 million tonnes per annum each of CO2 equivalents. And so the market is happening faster than the government will ever legislate. What we're going to do is we've got to deliver something that's real and have it audible, so that they've got confidence.
So, Harry, pioneers like yourself who have gone out and got the battle scars and learnt it through trial and error and that sort of thing, why are you incentivised to share your learnings with the rest of the world, like you're doing now on stage? What motivates you to actually share that knowledge rather than keep it as your own IP?
Because it's a massive opportunity. It's far beyond anything I could ever do, and it's for the betterment of the planet. And the more people that get into it, the faster the better. When at that one offset we did last year, another colleague calculated that it was equivalent to taking 700,000 cars off the road permanently. So if you wanted, it's significant, and we need to get on and prove that we need to work out the methods of doing it, and obviously stitched into that there's plenty of opportunities for us to front run lots of slow adopters and whatever else. So I've got no problem, and part of our charter in our fund, part of the reason people invest in us is because we've got a commitment to share knowledge, because it's actually not, unlike a lot of other industries, this competitive advantage is not it's the execution side of agriculture that's the key. I could tell you everyone in this room how to make compost, but I'll guarantee you that it'll take you 5 years to work out how to do it through trial and error.
I came from the payments business. It's a weird step from banking and payments to agriculture. And the thing that brought me is that there's some problems in the world that are really big and hard, and you cannot do them by yourself because they're systemic problems. But they're really important problems to solve. So payments, I don't want to dwell on that, but payments, you need people all over the world to make a mobile payment system. You need people all over the world to get rid of cash. I was thrilled when I moved to Australia and I just need to use my credit card. I haven't used cash since I've been here. It's amazing. And no one company could have done that by themselves. My little company did a little bit over in the corner, but if we hadn't shared with others, it wouldn't have grown. And the problem in agriculture and the problem with reversing global warming, which is really what we're talking about, that's a problem that no one person can solve by themselves. No one company can solve by themselves, but we're all going to get better, and to be honest, as a capitalist, we're all going to get richer if we're all in the game, right? So.
All right. Well, I think our time is up. But thank you, Guy, Margaret, and Harry. And yes, we will be circulating around, but thank you for all your efforts. And yes, may the regenerative agriculture revolution continue and continue toot sweet, I should say. Yeah. Thank you, everybody.